Germany didn't collapse overnight. It was a meticulous descent, camouflaged by order, discipline, and national pride. While the world looked the other way, the Third Reich was silently building its most dangerous weapon, a generation of children molded to never doubt, never think, and obey until death. This isn't just the story of a youth organization. It's the story of how a regime turned childhood into ammunition. It all began long before the war, when Germany was still licking its wounds after the defeat of 1918. The Hitler Youth and the Reich Dream. In the defeated Germany of the 1920s, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, economically devastated and plagued by uncertainty, something more than a political reaction was brewing. A profound, silent but implacable transformation was underway, beginning with the youngest members of the youth. It was then that a movement emerged that promised order, identity, and belonging to a new national community, the Hitler Youth. At first, it was nothing more than a small, powerless group. Founded in 1922, it only attracted a handful of young people in Munich. It wasn't a priority for the National Socialist Party, which focused its energies on winning over adults. But they soon realized that the future of their revolution required more than fiery speeches. It required shaping an entire generation from childhood. Inspired in part by the Wandervogel movement, a German youth hiking tradition that extolled nature, folklore, and camaraderie, the founders of the Hitler Youth borrowed its symbols, songs, rituals, and even the use of the Heil greeting. But unlike the Wandervogel, which was born as a romantic escape from modern materialism, the Hitler Youth was destined for something else, to serve as a breeding ground for a future elite of loyal soldiers and fanatics. The early years were marked by slow and fragmented growth. The various youth factions within the party vied for control, and many regional leaders were wary of centralization. However, toward the end of the 1920s, under the leadership of Kurt Gruber, and then crucially under Baldur von Schirach, the movement began to consolidate. Schirach was barely 24 years old when he was appointed national leader of all National Socialist youth. He had grown up in luxury, with aristocratic and family roots in the United States. But his devotion to Hitler was total. For him, the goal was not simply to organize recreational activities, it was to forge the new German man. From the age of 10, German children were inducted into the Jungvolk, the children's section of the Hitler Youth. At 14, they joined the Hitler Youth itself. From that moment on, their world was regulated, their time managed, and their spirit shaped by Nazi ideology. School took a back seat. Indoctrination was the most important thing. They learned to march, to obey, to denounce, to sing martial songs, to read maps and throw practice grenades. The physical exercises were intense, the punishments immediate. But the most important thing was the invisible, the education of character. The young men were taught that the Führer's will was their own, that sacrifice was the highest form of existence, and that their lives belonged to the community of the German people, not to their parents or themselves. As they approached the age of 17, the best among them, the most loyal, the strongest, the most ruthless, were selected for entry into special academies such as the Napolas or the Ordenburgen. There, the indoctrination became total. They were no longer mere youths, they were apprentice commanders. Contact with home was reduced or completely eliminated. Everything was designed to break family ties and replace them with the only bond that mattered, that of comrade, of race, of the Reich. This was no coincidence. The Hitler Youth had been conceived as an elite-producing machine. Its ranks would produce not only future Wehrmacht soldiers, but also SS officers, agents of the feared SD, political commissars, and even concentration camp guards. In 1936, Hitler made it clear, "These are my boys. No one will ever have them. They belong to me." The rise of the Hitler Youth was meteoric. In 1932, they had barely 100,000 members. 3 years later, they exceeded 4 million. After Hitler came to power, membership went from optional to mandatory. By 1939, with few exceptions, all German males were enrolled in the system. At the same time, young women were recruited into the BDM, the League of German Girls, where they were prepared for their role as mothers and wives in service to the Reich. In every city, in every town, Sundays were training days. With their brown uniforms, drums, and flags, the Hitler Youth platoons marched through the streets like small armies. Some enrolled in specialized sections, the Air Force, the Navy, and signals. Others learned to survive in the mountains, build bridges, or ride motorcycles. But all, without exception, absorbed the same creed: hatred of the weak, veneration of strength, and the conviction that the destiny of the German people was to conquer or die. Those who showed the greatest enthusiasm were sent to special camps. There, for example, SS instructors organized combat training. They were taught how to shoot, how to ambush, and how to use explosives. Some were sent as volunteers to work on racially pure farms in the East. This was part of the selection process for something bigger, the Waffen-SS. By 1940, Himmler had already ordered that the best of the Hitler Youth be absorbed directly into the ranks of his organization. It was a natural step. Those who had been molded from childhood to serve without question were ready to become executioners. Thus began the transformation. A 10-year-old boy entered the Jungvolk. At 14, he joined the HJ. At 17, if he was obedient and tough enough, he entered the Napola or an SS training camp. And at 18, he was wielding a rifle dressed in black with the Totenkopf skull on his cap. And that was just the beginning. In the next chapter of this story, we'll see how these young men, once elite soldiers, were thrust onto the battlefields of Europe, first as propaganda symbols and later as desperate fighters in the last stand for the Reich. From children to soldiers, the school of obedience. Indoctrination wasn't enough. That child who was moved by patriotic songs and marched proudly in Jungvolk parades had to become something more: a disciplined body, a malleable will, a machine for obedience. That's what the true structure of the Hitler Youth was for. From the age of 10, German children entered a perfectly hierarchical system. Each local group answered to a higher structure: platoons, companies, battalions, all the way to the Bahn, the equivalent of a regiment. Each unit had its standard bearer, its leader, and its rules. Discipline was strict. Minor infractions could mean physical punishment or public humiliation. But that wasn't all. At 14, upon passing from the Jungvolk to the Hitler Youth, adolescents were already subjected to physical tests, medical examinations, and character assessments. Their fate was decided by adults who sought out the best among them: the toughest, the coldest, the most obedient. It wasn't just about rewarding physical prowess, but about identifying a human type. The type who would kneel before the Führer without flinching, who would obey an order without question. The best were sent to special schools: the Napola, National Political Institutes of Education, and the Adolf Hitler Schools. These centers were veritable elite factories. There, the students lived in boarding schools, wore uniforms every day, and their teachers were often active SS officers. At the Napola, each student was called a Jungmann and lived under a quasi-military regime. The program included academic studies, intensive physical training, forced marches, shooting, reading racial texts, and political indoctrination. Academics were only a minor part of the program. The true goal was to develop hardened and ruthless leaders for the Reich. In parallel, the Adolf Hitler Schools, established in 1937 at the initiative of Baldur von Schirach and Robert Ley, offered an even more selective education. Admission wasn't based on academic merit, but on political selection, ideological loyalty, Aryan ancestry, and physical strength. Children were observed for days in special camps before being admitted. Those who passed the test not only left their families behind, but also any possibility of independent thinking. But not all young people followed this elite path. For the masses, there were the Wehrertüchtigungslager, or military training camps of the Hitler Youth. There, thousands of adolescents between the ages of 15 and 18 received basic military training: shooting, grenade practice, camouflage, terrain orientation, and combat drills. In 3 weeks, the average boy was transformed into a recruit ready to join the Waffen-SS or the Eastern Front. The Waffen-SS, in particular, was responsible for overseeing this training. While nominally it was the Wehrmacht that provided instructors at the banner, it was the SS that provided decorated officers as educators, many of them veterans of the Russian front. Some had fought in the Leibstandarte Division, Hitler's personal guard. From them, the young men learned that the supreme value was sacrifice. The training wasn't symbolic. The Hitler Youth had their own shooting schools, such as the one at Obermatzfeld, where air gunners were trained even before the war. But at the height of the war, the use of real weapons became the norm. It is estimated that during the combat years, up to 1.5 million adolescents received firearms training. Every month, millions of shots were fired by 14 and 15-year-olds. Those who showed special talent were promoted. At 16, they could become Kriegsführer, war leaders, if they completed intensive youth leadership courses. In many cases, they were only 2 or 3 years older than the children they led. The motto became literal: youth must be led by youth. Some specialized. There were naval, air, and even signals divisions. Luftwaffe technical schools trained teenagers as aeronautical technicians, while others learned to build gliders, operate radios, or navigate small boats. Everything was designed to offer the Third Reich a parallel silent army hidden behind beardless faces. They weren't just trained, they were also monitored. Within the Hitler Youth, the Streifendienst operated a sort of internal police force that investigated loyalty, punished doubts, and denounced any ideological deviation. They collaborated directly with the Gestapo and the SS. Recruits for concentration camps and the dreaded SS officer schools emerged from their ranks. What had seemed like a youth organization had become a central cog in the Nazi machine. It didn't just train bodies, it formed fanatical minds and hearts willing to die and kill for an idea. Mass incorporation after Stalingrad. On February 2, 1943, the German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad. With more than 90,000 soldiers captured and hundreds of thousands dead, the defeat marked the beginning of the military collapse of the Third Reich. But it also meant something else, the beginning of a desperate mobilization. And in that mobilization, young people took center stage. Less than 2 weeks later, on February 16th, while Germany was still mourning the fallen and fearing a Soviet invasion, Hitler authorized the formation of a new Waffen-SS armored division, staffed exclusively by teenagers. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. Its name said it all. It was no longer about training adult soldiers inspired by the youthful ideal. Now, the young people themselves were the fighting force. 16 and 17-year-old boys, many still in Hitler Youth uniform, were sent to recruitment centers, such as the Beverloo camp in Belgium. By July and August 1943, more than 10,000 boys were training there. Some were not even 17. Not all of them were volunteers. Many had attempted to enlist in the Luftwaffe or the Kriegsmarine, but were reassigned to the Waffen-SS. The need for cannon fodder was so urgent that even compulsory prior service in the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the National Labor Corps, was waived, and the young men were sent directly to military training. The first commander was Fritz Witt, a decorated veteran of the Leibstandart division. He wasn't a politician, he was a respected military man, and his task was daunting. Transforming children into soldiers capable of facing the British, Canadians, or Soviets with just weeks of training. Problems soon arose. There weren't enough experienced officers. 50 officers were recruited from the army, many of them former Hitler Youth leaders. Non-commissioned officers with no combat experience were hastily promoted. Young men who excelled in training camps were sent to Waffen-SS schools in Lauenburg, where they were converted into platoon leaders within 3 months. Many of these new commanders lacked any real frontline experience. Their authority depended on fear or fanaticism. As a result, the units were brave to the point of suicide. In Normandy, months later, their desperate attacks would cost thousands of lives. But in 1943, propaganda presented them as Germany's last hope. That year's slogan made it clear: Kriegseinsatz der deutschen Jugend, the war service of German youth. It was a slogan that became literal. For Waffen-SS recruiting officers, the Hitler Youth training camps, the Wehrertüchtigungslager, were a perfect breeding ground. There they could select young men before they were assigned to the regular army. All they had to do was convince them to offer themselves as volunteers. The legal age was 18, but in practice even younger people were accepted. For Goebbels, the new division's name was a mistake. He warned that it would show the enemy how desperate Germany was to the point of sending teenagers to the front. But Hitler prevailed. "They will be our most fanatical soldiers," he said, "and our most loyal." Training to die, forging a youth division. Turning teenagers into soldiers was no easy task. Turning them into an elite Waffen-SS armored division ready to stop an Allied landing was a downright historical aberration. But that was exactly what Nazi Germany attempted to do after Stalingrad. The result was called the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. It all began in June 1943. Hitler authorized the direct recruitment of young men born in 1926. They were 17 years old, although many were barely 16. The instructions were clear: recruit quickly, train even faster, send them to the front. That same summer, the first contingents, some 10,000 teenagers, were assembled at Beverloo, a training camp in Belgium. The place was unprepared. Uniforms, weapons, and vehicles were lacking. But that didn't stop basic training from beginning. The division was organized into infantry regiments, a panzer regiment, an artillery regiment, and engineering, anti-aircraft, anti-tank, and communications units. From the beginning, everything was done under pressure. The chosen commander was Fritz Witt, a decorated veteran of Adolf Hitler's Leibstandarte SS, who had won the Knight's Cross in France and the Oak Leaves in Kharkiv. At 34 years old, he was respected by his troops and was not a fanatic but a professional soldier. His mission, to transform thousands of teenagers into functional combatants in less than a year. The first problem was the lack of command. There weren't enough officers or non-commissioned officers. 50 army commanders were brought in, many of them former Hitler youth leaders. Young men with prior training in Wehrertüchtigungslager, pre-military training camps, were rapidly promoted and sent to the Waffen-SS non-commissioned officer school in Lauenburg for 3 months of training. None of them had any actual combat experience. They would later make up for this lack with reckless aggression. Physical and tactical training began immediately. But unlike other SS units, there were no ceremonial marches or goose-stepping. Witt knew that such formalities would destroy the morale of such inexperienced young men. Instead, a more informal relationship between officers and soldiers was encouraged. Company commanders were even asked to write to the parents of their recruits to strengthen the human bond. Orders were given with an explanation of their rationale. The goal was not just to obey, but to understand. Realistic maneuvers were practiced with live fire. Combat conditions were simulated to the maximum: trenches, explosions, darkness, confusion, fatigue. The idea was to prepare the young men for the brutal reality of the Western Front. At Guderian's own recommendation, rifle practice was perfected. Even von Rundstedt and Guderian attended the maneuvers and praised the efficiency achieved in such a short time. Meanwhile, equipment was scarce. By October 1943, the division's Panzer Regiment had only 8 operational tanks, 4 Panzer IVs and 4 Panthers, brought illegally from the Eastern Front. Artillery was limited. Trucks were old. Vehicles from the defeated Italian army were requisitioned and soon abandoned due to lack of spare parts. Morale, however, was high. Propaganda extolled esprit de corps and pride in belonging to a division named after the Reich's youth movement. The idea of sacrifice was exalted. The young men were told repeatedly that their destiny was not to survive, but to die for Germany. The result of all this was an ideologically fanaticized youth force, physically trained and psychologically conditioned to act without question. They knew no reality other than obedience. They had not lived in times of peace. Their childhood had been spent amidst marches, flags, and speeches, their adolescence amidst training camps and automatic weapons. When the division was finally mobilized to France in April 1944, it was ready for action. Its next destination would be Normandy, where it would engage in combat against Canadian and British forces. There, in the fields of northern France, the effectiveness of a unique military experiment would be tested, throwing thousands of teenagers onto the battlefield, armed to the teeth, convinced that dying was an honor. Normandy, the Hitler Youth in the trial by fire. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the skies above Normandy roared with unprecedented violence. It was D-Day. Allied airborne troops descended on the French countryside, while thousands of British, Canadian, and American soldiers landed on the beaches under a hail of gunfire. 100 kilometers east of the front, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend received its first battle order to march immediately toward Caen and halt the Allied advance. The division was no ordinary unit. It had been conceived since 1943 as an elite panzer force composed mostly of young men born between 1926 and 1927. That is, adolescents aged 16 to 18, trained in the ranks of the Hitler Youth and indoctrinated from childhood. Many had dreamed of piloting airplanes or navigating submarines. but were redirected almost by force into the Waffen-SS. Their intensive but brief training was supervised by veteran officers of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and culminated in Beverloo, Belgium, with actual combat exercises supervised by Guderian and von Rundstedt himself. In material terms, the division was incomplete. Of the 186 authorized tanks, they had only 119 at the time of the invasion. The Panzer Brigade, which was to form the offensive corps of the unit, was equipped mainly with Panzer IV AOSF, H and Panther tanks, many of them reconditioned from the Eastern Front. The supply of transport vehicles was also deficient. Of the 2,214 trucks required, only 1,834 were operational. Despite these limitations, the young men were eager to test themselves. During their march to Caen, they were relentlessly harassed by Allied fighter bombers. The 70-mile journey left a trail of burned-out vehicles and teenage corpses on the side of the road, but they arrived, and without respite, they were thrown into combat. The first clash took place around Buron and Orthy against the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. There, the young Panzer Grenadiers and tank crews managed to destroy 28 enemy tanks at the cost of only 6 of their own. It was a clear demonstration of their tactical prowess and their brutality. At Authie, troops under the command of SS Sturmbannführer Kurt Meyer, aka Panzer Meyer, were accused of executing more than 150 Canadian prisoners of war, crimes for which Meyer would be tried after the war. The division's ferocity soon became legendary. At Carpiquet, Éperon, Verrières Ridge, and Fontenay-le-Pesnel, fighting raged on a house-to-house basis, with flamethrowers, panzerfausts, and close combat in cellars and stairwells. One British commander said that they came at our tanks like wolves. We had to kill them against our will. The tank crews, many of them young men as young as 18, displayed suicidal recklessness. They advanced without air cover, under orders not to retreat. They used ambush maneuvers and crossfire from hidden positions among Norman hedges. The reconnaissance battalion operated with motorcycles and half-tracks to identify targets in already destroyed villages, while the anti-aircraft units attempted to repel the Allied Typhoons without much success. On June 14th, an Allied shell hit the division headquarters, killing its commander, Fritz Witt. His replacement was 33-year-old Kurt Meyer, a former miner turned SS icon, fanatical, charismatic, daring, and decorated on the Eastern Front. Under his command, the young men fought even more intensely. For the Allies, the division represented their first direct encounter with the generation born under the Third Reich. Young people who knew no other life than that dictated by the brown uniform, Goebbels' propaganda, and the cult of the Führer. For them, the Allied bombing raids were not simple attacks. They were a war against the German people. And they fought with that conviction. In mid-July, as the front threatened to collapse, the Hitler Youth was briefly withdrawn, but 6 days later it was sent back to hell, this time to the heart of the Falaise pocket, where the Allies were closing in on the German forces. There, with only a fraction of their men, they fought to open a breach. It was a carnage amid crossfire and columns of refugees. Many died, others were captured, only a few escaped. When they crossed the Meuse River near Ivoire on September 4, 1944, only 600 men remained. They had no tanks, they had no artillery, they had no food. Field Marshal von Rundstedt bitterly commented, "It is a shame that this faithful youth has been sacrificed in a hopeless situation. Normandy wasn't just the Hitler Youth's baptism by fire, it was their grave, a grave of molten steel, blood and ash. But it wouldn't be the end. Just weeks later they would be reconstituted, and in December they would be thrown back into battle, this time in the Ardennes." The Ardennes, the last assault of the Hitler Jugend Division. Autumn 1944. After the bloody retreat from the Falaise encirclement and the desperate crossing of the Meuse River, what remained of the 12th SS Division Hitler Jugend was reduced to 600 exhausted men and not a single operational tank. Barely a handful of survivors without ammunition, without artillery, and with their bodies and spirits worn out by weeks of uninterrupted fighting in Normandy. The once feared Panzer Division was now a shadow, a symbolic force sustained more by propaganda than by military reality. And yet, in Berlin, no one was talking about withdrawal. In the corridors of Hitler's headquarters, a last desperate plan was being hatched. a thrust through the frozen forests of the Belgian Ardennes designed to split the Allied armies, encircle their logistical centre at Bastogne, and capture the port of Antwerp, essential for Anglo-American supplies. Its codename, Wacht am Rhein. It was all or nothing. The Reich was gambling its last strategic reserve. To this end, the 12th SS was temporarily withdrawn from the front and sent to Kaiserslautern for forced reconstruction. There, Arthur Axmann, head of the Hitler Youth, personally distributed Hitler Jugend armbands as a tribute to the Normandy survivors. The gesture sought to reaffirm the unit's identity. They were not simply soldiers, but the living symbol of German youth sacrificed for the Reich. The new draft included thousands of adolescents between the ages of 16 and 17, former members of the Jungvolk, war orphans, young men recruited from schools or youth military training camps. Most had never seen actual combat. They all shared one trait. They had been shaped by Nazi propaganda since childhood, and they viewed death in combat not as a tragedy, but as the culmination of their political and spiritual destiny. Formally, they were no longer a panzer division. They were reclassified as a Kampfgruppe, a combat group without the required structure or equipment. But that didn't stop their mobilization. In December, already deployed south of Aachen, the Hitler Jugend was integrated into the ISS Panzer Corps, along with the veteran Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Totenkopf, and the dreaded Kampfgruppe Piper. On December 16, 1944, in the dead of winter, the attack began. Amidst heavy snowfall, sub-zero temperatures, and mountainous terrain covered in ice and mud, the young Germans broke through the American lines. Their sector encompassed the Hürtgen Forest, a region already devastated by weeks of fighting. The first few hours offered some progress, but the strategic surprise soon faded. The American forces, despite being poorly positioned, offered fierce resistance. In towns such as Rocherath, Würzfeld, Krinkelt, and Büllingen, the Hitler Youth's Panzer IVs and Panthers were stopped by artillery fire, bazooka ambushes, and anti-tank mines camouflaged in the snow-covered roads. At La Glaise, the unit engaged in house-to-house fighting, throwing grenades through windows, setting fire to barns with flamethrowers, and entrenching themselves in cellars with hiding civilians. Sectors were retaken by the US 1st Infantry Division, which attacked with tactical air support as soon as weather permitted. Allied intelligence reports described with bewilderment the fanaticism of the fighters, teenagers who refused to surrender even when surrounded, who preferred to die in their positions rather than abandon their mission. On several occasions, entire squads were annihilated without so much as a white flare. This wasn't just tactics. It was a form of militarized political religion. The offensive began to stall on December 22nd, when the Allied reaction, led by Patton from the south, began to close the encirclement around Bastogne. On December 27th, the skies cleared. It was the final doom. Allied fighter bombers reappeared in full force. Supply convoys were destroyed en masse. Retreating columns were massacred from the air. For the Hitler Youth, it was Normandy all over again. No support, no reserves, no chance of recovery. They fought for days, scattered in small groups, covering the retreat of other units. Some veteran Wehrmacht officers watched in horror as the younger ones charged into battle without tactical coordination, but with a suicidal will that frightened even the enemy. The Ardennes offensive cost Germany more than 100,000 casualties. For the Hitler Youth, it was the second total destruction in less than 6 months. They were reduced to disjointed remnants of units with barely a few hundred men, no tanks, no artillery, no ammunition. And yet they were not dissolved. In January 1945, Hitler ordered them transferred to Hungary to face the Soviet machine on the Lake Balaton steppe. From the frozen forests of Belgium to the Danube swamps, the fate of these teenagers followed the logic of a machine that didn't know how to stop, a machine that, as Marshal von Rundstedt said, no longer sacrificed soldiers, but entire generations of faith, flesh, and ashes. Hungary, 1945, the last march of the Hitler Jugend Division. January 1945. Germany was crumbling. The Eastern Front was hemorrhaging unstoppably. The Red Army was advancing from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Balkans. In the west, the Ardennes had failed, but Hitler had one obsession: Budapest. The Hungarian capital, surrounded by the Soviets since December 1944, was seen by the Führer not only as a vital strategic point, but also as a symbolic issue. Germany's last Allied capital in the east had to be defended to the bitter end or reconquered. Thus was born Operation Frühlingserwachen, the last major German counterattack of the conflict. And once again the Hitler Jugend division was called up. After its devastating participation in the Ardennes, what remained of the unit was sent to southern Germany to be reconstituted. It was no longer a true division, barely a reinforced battle group, nourished with remnants of other units, recycled privates, and once again teenagers recruited in an emergency. By January 1945, Nazi Germany was in a state of collapse. The Red Army had crossed the Vistula, and Berlin was no longer a shadow on the horizon. It was a tangible objective. To the west, after the bloody defeat in the Ardennes, the Allies were inexorably advancing towards the Rhine. Against this desperate backdrop, Adolf Hitler ordered one last major offensive, not in Germany but in Hungary. Why Hungary? Because its fields still held the last operational oil wells of the Reich, especially in the Nagy-Kanisa region. Without that fuel, the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe would cease to function completely. Moreover, the city of Budapest had been surrounded by Soviet troops for weeks, and Hitler insisted that it must be rescued as a symbolic gesture to his allies and to history. Thus was born Operation Frühlingserwachen, or Spring Awakening, launched on March 6, 1945. A reckless offensive, plotted from the offices of Hitler's Berlin headquarters, aimed at pushing the Soviets eastward, reconnecting with Budapest, and securing the oil fields of southern Hungary. It was an operational fantasy. But like so many others in the Reich, it was driven with fanaticism and executed at a cost of human life. Among the units chosen for this operation was the remnants of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend. After being nearly wiped out in Normandy and the Ardennes, the division had been partially rebuilt with new recruits, many of whom were inexperienced teenagers. Boys as young as 16 or 17, some recruited straight from schools or plucked from the rubble of their bombed-out towns. For many, it was the first time they had ever held a real weapon. For others, it would also be the last. The division was integrated into the ISS Panzerkorps alongside the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the Totenkopf and Kampfgruppe Keitel. These were names that still commanded respect within the German army, but by March 1945 they were little more than armored phantoms, bled-out units surviving on poorly trained replacements, tanks without fuel, and increasingly irrational orders. The Hitler Youth's assigned axis of advance lay between Székesfehérvár and Stuhlweissenberg, northeast of Lake Balaton, the largest lake in Central Europe. The terrain was horribly unfavorable. The March rains had turned the fields into impassable swamps, the country roads were narrow and muddy, and the wooded areas impeded any effective mechanized movement. What was supposed to be a rapid push toward Budapest turned into a snail's pace of fighting, with tanks stuck in the mud and soldiers clinging to tree roots to avoid sinking. The Soviet Fifth Guards Army, already forewarned by intelligence, had fortified the advance routes with anti-tank mines, barbed wire, and concealed artillery positions. For the Hitler Youth soldiers, many of whom had never heard the sound of a falling shell, it was immediate hell. The Soviet fire was constant, accurate, and merciless. The Panther tanks, the pride of the division, were swallowed up in the mud before they could fire. Infantry columns stopped to dig out tracks and were annihilated by mortar fire. During the first 5 days, the front barely advanced a few kilometers. Some villages changed hands twice in a single day. The Soviets used barrage fire to break the rhythm of the attacks, and when the German positions solidified, they launched waves of hardened infantry counterattacks at Stalingrad and Kursk. The Hitler Youth's resistance was brave but tragic. One of their officers wrote in a letter intercepted by the Allies, "They are good boys. They don't complain, they don't ask questions, they shoot, they cry in silence, then they reload. Many die without even knowing where they are." Indeed, these teenagers weren't fighting for strategy or for their country. They were fighting because they knew nothing else. Their entire lives had been spent among marches, harangues, maps, and slogans, and now the Hungarian mud was their grave. On March 16, 1945, Operation Frühlingserwachen was officially cancelled. The Lake Balaton offensive, Hitler's final offensive attempt, had failed. The German tanks had bogged down in the Hungarian mud. The Soviet forces, better supplied, organized, and reinforced by the experience of years of total war, not only resisted, they counterattacked with overwhelming force. Within days, the hope of liberating Budapest and protecting the Nagy-Kanisa oil fields was buried in mud, fire, and corpses. Hitler, stubborn to the very end, refused to acknowledge the disaster, calling it an operational reorganization. But the reality was more brutal. The ISS Panzer Corps was decimated. The 12th SS Division Hitlerjugend, composed of malnourished teenagers and exhausted veterans, had been shattered once again. As had happened in Normandy and the Ardennes, the division became the Reich's last-minute shield. In the following weeks, the remnants of the unit began a desperate retreat across Austria, closely pursued by Red Army armoured columns. With no air cover, no fuel, and only a handful of serviceable armoured vehicles, the Hitlerjugend fragmented into small battle groups, each operating autonomously, attempting to delay the Soviet advance long enough to reach US-occupied territory. Conditions were inhumane. On the rural roads of western Hungary and southern Austria, German tanks, often horse-drawn or pushed by their crews, bogged down in bombed-out villages or were abandoned due to lack of fuel. Allied reports spoke of columns of unarmed, barefoot German soldiers in tattered uniforms wading among displaced civilians, the wounded, and rubble. Only the name remained of the once feared Panzer Division. By the end of April, the division had barely 455 men and a single functional tank. In some cases, the soldiers didn't even know the war was ending. They kept marching because no one had given them an order to the contrary. Their commanders, between demoralization and duty, tried to maintain cohesion with remnants of formal discipline. They slept in stables, ate whatever they could find, and the fighting was improvised. Every hill was defended like a last trench. Every crossroads could be the end. Morale among the boys was tense but obedient. Many knew they wouldn't leave Hungary alive. Some deserted, others died with their rifles in hand. On at least 2 occasions, entire squads were wiped out by mortar fire in areas where cover hadn't even been dug. The experience of Normandy and the Ardennes hadn't prepared them for this. The Soviets were relentless. On March 15th, the offensive failed. The remnants of the Hitler Youth began to withdraw, along with the other units of the SS Panzer Corps. The retreat was slow and bloody, amid devastated villages, dynamited roads, and constant air attacks. The boys fought their way back, firing from barns, forests, and abandoned railway stations. During this final stage, many casualties were caused by lack of ammunition, disease, and hunger. The supply chain had been broken, fuel was scarce, armoured vehicles were abandoned on the roads. Some soldiers dug holes with their hands to sleep in the mud. The image of that day is etched in the accounts of Allied officers. A single tank on the move, several soldiers without boots, a 17-year-old boy with a machine gun slung over his shoulder, and the Iron Cross still shining on his chest. The cruelest symbol of the Third Reich was not a ruined building, but an armed child walking among the ashes. The division that had been created as a banner of the new National Socialist man, young, fanatical, indestructible, ended thus, exhausted, aimless, and captured by an enemy that no longer feared it. And with that surrender, the circle was closed. Of the 20,000 men who made up the unit in 1944, only a few hundred remained alive and free. They had crossed Normandy, the Ardennes, Hungary, and Austria. Some would be tried, others would hide their past for decades. But for all of them, the end came amidst mountains, cold and silence. The Reich had promised them glory, it handed them death and left them alone. Berlin, 1945, the final sacrifice of the Hitler Youth. At the end of April 1945, Berlin was a dying city. Soviet artillery bombarded day and night. The streets were pockmarked with craters, rubble covered the facades, and thick smoke made it impossible to distinguish dawn from dusk. It was the end. The Third Reich was disintegrating under enemy fire. The Wehrmacht no longer existed as a coherent force. The Waffen-SS resisted in small groups. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed, and in that chaos, amid the remnants of an empire of propaganda and hatred, the last to fight were children. Children with Panzerfausts, with rusty rifles, with uniforms that were too big and helmets that covered their eyes. Children who barely knew how to load a weapon, but who had been raised with the conviction that dying for Hitler was an honor. From the beginning of April, under pressure from Soviet bombing raids, Reichsjugendführer Arthur Axmann ordered the mobilization of all available members of the Hitler Youth. Boys between the ages of 12 and 17 were organized into improvised battalions, many of them integrated into the Volkssturm or under the direct command of the SS. There was no real military training. Some barely knew how to march, but a weapon was placed in their hands and they were told, "Now is your time. The fate of the Reich rests in your hands." On April 23, 1945, a week before the fall, Axmann gave his most desperate order to form a defensive line on the Pichelsdorf bridges over the Havel, to keep them open against the supposed arrival of Wenck's army, Hitler's imaginary relief force. That force in reality did not exist, but the young men didn't know this. They believed that if they held out for a few more days, reinforcements would arrive. They believed because they had been raised to believe. Some 5,000 teenagers, most of them under 17, were stationed in shallow trenches on Heerstrasse opposite the railway station. Many were alone or in pairs, hidden among trees or behind posts, armed only with old rifles or a Panzerfaust. At dawn, the dark silhouettes of Soviet T-34s could be seen approaching slowly, their guns already trained on the bridges. The bombardment was devastating. Within a few hours, the boys' lines were leveled by artillery, tank, and machine gun fire. Witnesses recalled that the bodies were so light that the shells threw them several meters. After 5 days of fighting, only 500 boys were still alive and fit to fight. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. But this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a strategy of total sacrifice decided from the Führer bunker. In neighborhoods like Oranienburg, Charlottenburg, and Schlossplatz, children were literally taken from their homes by the police, gathered in groups of 10 or 12, armed with whatever was available, and sent directly to the urban front. Some were as young as 13, some didn't even know how to shoot. A German officer described how the children were gathered in SS barracks and divided into units called Fähnlein, each assigned to a combat sector. Many died trying to cross open fields under Soviet machine gun fire. The town of Oranienburg changed hands 4 times in 2 days. Most did not survive. When some attempted to flee, the SS response was brutal. A 15-year-old boy who refused to continue fighting was hanged from a tree by a squad of SA and SS officers as a warning. Others, captured by their own commanders, were summarily executed as deserters. On April 20th, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, the dictator stepped out into the Chancellery Garden for the last time. In front of the cameras, he awarded 20 Hitler Youth children the Iron Cross, second class. Some were 12 years old. Hitler, his arm trembling, clapped his congratulations, murmured a few words and returned to the bunker. He would not emerge again. It was his last public appearance. Meanwhile, the fighting continued. In the subway stations, in the Reichstag gardens, on rooftops and in basements, the boys fought to the bitter end. Fed for years on myths about Langemarck, Horst Wessel, martyrs and heroes, they believed that death was the supreme duty. Sometimes they threw themselves at the tanks with Panzerfausts without even knowing how they worked. Others died without firing. Some cried in fear and continued firing anyway. For several days they fought without food or water, without relief, without clear direction. Survivors described horrific scenes. Wounded children crawling among corpses, 14-year-olds who remained stationed next to dead friends for hours, unaware that they were alone. Some hid under bodies to avoid being seen by the Soviets. And even more macabre, the Soviets reported finding bodies of boys with the medal still hanging around their necks, their fingers on the trigger, their lips burned from having bitten the last bullet, a desperate act to avoid capture or humiliation. On April 30th, 1945, as Hitler shot himself in the head, the last children of the Reich died above ground, defending the rubble, unaware that their idol was no more. On the street, death was anonymous. In the bunker, silence sealed the end. Within hours, the Red Army stormed the Chancellery. Nearby, corpses of young Hitler Youth lay among the ruins. Some still had their eyes open. The Reich's ultimate dream, that of an eternally faithful youth ready to die, became its most obscene condemnation. They had been raised to obey, not to understand, to kill, not to question, to die, not to live. And they died by the thousands, amid cobblestones, flames and smoke. Not for Germany, not for the people, but for the broken promise of an empire made of slogans and lies. Post-war, the fate of the Hitler Youth after the Third Reich. When the ruins of Berlin cooled and the gunpowder stopped floating over Europe, a different kind of battle began. It was no longer about gunfire or bombs, but about questions. What to do with the young men who had fought for Nazism? How to judge those who, at 14 or 16, took up a Panzerfaust and died shouting Heil Hitler? What responsibility lay with those who had grown up knowing nothing but the brown uniform, the raised arm salute, and the pledge of loyalty to the Führer? The Hitler Youth, with more than 8 million members by the end of the war, was not just a youth organization. It was the Nazi regime's most effective indoctrination mechanism. From the age of 10, German boys and girls were molded to obey, march, silence their doubts, denounce their parents if necessary, and die if ordered. This ideological machinery was so effective that in the final days of the Reich, many of them died in combat believing they were fighting for Germany's future. But with the surrender, that structure collapsed, and the other side of the disaster began: denazification. At the Nuremberg trials, the leaders of the Third Reich faced the verdict of the world. Among them, Baldur von Schirach, the first Reichsjugendführer, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. His crime was not leading an armed organization, but creating a generation without a will of its own, incapable of distinguishing between obedience and morality. In his defense, Schirach said, "I too was a victim of the system." But the tribunal did not accept that argument. His responsibility lay in creating it. Another notable figure was Arthur Axmann, who had replaced Schirach and commanded the Hitler Youth during the war. Axmann was not tried at Nuremberg, but in 1949 a denazification tribunal in Berlin sentenced him to 3 years and 3 months in prison. He was found guilty of maintaining the Hitler Youth as an instrument of radical indoctrination and of voluntarily sending minors to the front. Years later, he was arrested again for trafficking in false documents, but he never showed remorse. He died in 1996, a free man. And what happened to the millions of former members? Most weren't tried or imprisoned. Many simply burned their uniforms, hid their insignia, and returned home. Occupied Germany lay in ruins, and the priority was to rebuild homes, schools, factories, and even souls. Some teenagers, freed from the Nazi structure, fell into an existential void. They didn't know what to do without songs, marches, or ranks. They had lost the war and their childhood. Thousands of them were interned in prison camps, not as criminals, but as ideologically contaminated individuals. In areas controlled by the Americans and British, re-education programs were implemented, with films about the concentration camps, talks on democracy, and required reading of authors banned under the regime. But the results were mixed. Many young people became emotionally withdrawn, convinced that what they had experienced was not a crime but a duty. A striking phenomenon was that of former members who became opponents of Nazism. Some, upon learning the magnitude of the Holocaust, felt betrayed. This is the case of Melita Maschmann, a former leader of the BDM, the women's branch of the Hitler Youth, who in the 1960s wrote devastating memoirs in which she acknowledged her complicity and moral blindness. Others, however, never renounced their past. Some retrained as professionals, politicians, or businessmen in West Germany, taking advantage of the social silence about the Nazi past during the years of the economic miracle. A symbolic example was Hans Ulrich Rudel, a war hero and former member of the Hitler Youth, who remained a public figure in far-right circles after the war. In the German Democratic Republic, treatment was harsher. The communist regime considered all former members of the Hitler Youth to be class enemies. Many were excluded from the educational or labor systems, and some, denounced by neighbors or former colleagues, ended up in labor camps. Eastern propaganda used their existence to justify ideological repression. Look what fascism produces. Over the years, the memory of the Hitler Youth became a collective taboo. For decades in Germany, speaking of having been a member was almost equivalent to a public confession of shame. No other Nazi organization left such a deep and ambiguous mark because its victims and perpetrators were often one and the same. Beginning in the 1980s and 1990s, some historians began to recover testimonies. Letters, diaries, and photos were discovered. The image of the German child soldier began to become more complex. They weren't simply perpetrators, nor were they martyrs. They were children molded to die. Young people transformed into human weapons by a regime that destroyed their capacity for thought. Some, after surviving, spent their lives trying to understand what had happened to them. Today, the last survivors are elderly. Many remained silent all their lives. Others only in recent years dared to speak out. Their accounts don't justify, but they explain. The Hitler Youth was not a youthful adventure. It was a systematic project of total control. And its most lasting legacy is the silent trauma of a generation that unknowingly was born to obey and was sent to die.